Hello, welcome to the ISTAT Learning Lab. Today we're going to see what lies beneath, what to expect in terms of restructurings of airlines and lessors and how to recover under your aircraft-backed investments. And to do that, we have Alton Aviation Consultancy, Leah Ryan, who is head of EMEA based in Dublin. And she is also assisted by Jen Tu, who is based in Hong Kong, also with Alton. And she's going to help Leah answer all the questions that you can post during Leah's presentation. And you can do that by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And then I will go over those questions with Leah and Jen. Now, Leah joined Alton in 2020. And before that, she spent 16 years with General Electric. Most of that time was with GCAS. And the last 3 years, she was the head of risk for PK Air Finance, the eminent aircraft-backed lender based in Luxembourg. Leah has a Bachelor of Science in Business Management from Trinity College in Dublin. Before I hand over to Leah, I just want to remind you that next Tuesday, we have another learning lab. It's going to be half an hour later than today, and it's going to be Olga from Oriel and Stuart from ICF to talk about the outlook for aircraft values. So remember to register for that. And then with that, I want to hand over to Leah Ryan at Dublin.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. And thanks for joining today's session. So today I'm going to just touch briefly on the current industry recovery status. I'll also talk a little bit about the aviation debt market, what we're seeing there. And also I will discuss some of the recent airline restructures, particularly Virgin Australia, which we were involved in. And essentially then, as we think about investors and all asset owners with interests, how we should continue and think about maximizing to get our ultimate recovery. So if I turn to the next page. So before COVID-19, the commercial air travel industry had been enjoying expansive growth and profitability for more than 9 years. And this rapidly reversed in March 2020 when passenger demand plummeted to extremely low levels. And that all happened around the period of spring and early summer 2020. According to final IATA figures for 2020, passenger revenues dropped by 69%, or 418 billion compared to 2019. Since the start of the pandemic, IATA revised those forecasts, both for 2020 and for 2021, downwards on several occasions. And although demand has somewhat recovered from these lows, it has remained weak in many regions during this year's summer 2021 travel season. And it only approached pre-COVID levels in select domestic markets. As at today, the industry appears to be on this upswing from this record low demand levels. The Northern Hemisphere 2021 travel season was much improved over the period, particularly in North America and Europe, as the vaccine rollout continued to expand. In terms of RPKs, we can see here that North America and Europe experienced the strongest regional growth due to fast recovery of vaccines and lifting of restrictions, although the new wave of COVID is casting more uncertainty. In some regions, such as Asia Pacific, which is represented by the green line, passenger revenues for 2021 will be lower than those of 2020. And Southeast Asia has been particularly hard hit and slow to recover, with 2021 passenger levels likely to be over 80% down from 2019 levels. Total industry revenues, which include record highs for the much stronger, albeit smaller cargo segment this year, are expected by IATA to drop by 44% in 2021 compared to 2019 levels of 472 billion. If I turn to the next page. Although the airline industry has historically been a challenging one for investors, so think 9/11, SARS, the GFC, and the impacts of Ebola virus in West Africa, several civil wars, terrorist attacks, Crimea, you name it, as well as, I presume, the most recent trade wars between the US and China, and how that quickly impacted the cargo market. The industry has made a profit every year from 2010 to 2019. So until COVID happened, it pretty much enjoyed these stable and profitable returns at margins that had not been seen for decades. Results from 2019 showed industry-wide profitability, but profits were not spread evenly across global regions and were slightly lower than 2019 profits. The total net profit for the airline industry for 2019 was 26.4 billion, with North America responsible for approximately 65% of industry profits, holding a share of approximately 17.4 billion. So the Northern American carriers improved profitability, and that was attributable post sort of the GFC bankruptcies, when those airlines had a period of subsequent consolidation. Their resulting pricing power, capacity discipline, cost improvement, and all of that echoed through its record load factors. Europe and the Asia Pacific regions, where demand was strong but yields were a little bit more challenging, each contributed sizable portions of the global profits, while the Middle East, Latin America, and Africa generated small regional losses. In the vast Asia Pacific region, in the vast Asia Pacific region, North Asia and Oceania accounted for almost all of the profits, as most airlines in Southeast Asia and South Asia were unprofitable. A reduction in total industry net losses is projected by IATA for 2020-22, just to 11.6 billion in total. And with the lead in traffic recovery is still in North America, IATA anticipates that this region will generate 57% of the total net profits to be achieved. If I turn to the next page. So here we can see that airlines enacted capacity cuts in response to the deteriorated demand environment. But as domestic restrictions began to lift during summer 2020, more aircraft were put back in service. And we can see this from the chart that the proportion of global fleet which is parked has decreased steadily from the spring. As of November 2020, less than 20% of passenger aircraft were parked, down from a high watermark of 68% in May 2020. So far in 2021, Sub-Saharan Africa has consistently shown the highest rates of parked aircraft, hovering around 40% of its passenger fleet. Middle East, North Africa, and Europe have seen improvements from 40% to 20 to 30%. North America's particularly strong market has helped it maintain a lower parked rate than most other regions. The Asia Pacific region has performed strongly as countries eased some of its domestic restrictions earlier than other regions, and had generally lower parked rates even during the deep phase of the crisis. Although recent developments of the pandemic within the region has halted the recovery. China particularly has had a low rate of parked aircraft throughout the crisis, while the rest of Asia Pacific has not performed as strongly. The low point in terms of fleet passed in May 2020, and many aircraft returned to service later in those summer months. And that happened across all fleet types, regions, and age. The trend has continued throughout 2021, primarily, as I said, driven by North American and European markets, although the rate at which aircraft returned to service had not been as rapid as some might have expected coming into the year. Our analysis shows that larger operators initially exhibiting higher parking rates have actually been faster to return aircraft into service. The largest operators by fleet size, so those greater than 150 aircraft, they have strong domestic networks and have been able to maintain capacity within these markets, and slightly better than smaller or mid-sized carriers, as well as benefiting from stronger funding sources and oftentimes government support. Since mature assets have higher maintenance costs and are less fuel efficient, it was expected that younger aircraft would be the most utilised cohort. And in fact, our analysis shows that 0 to 5-year-old aircraft were returned to service nearly twice as fast as older vintage aircraft. As demand eventually recovers, these older parked aircraft may be retired by larger carriers rather than returned to service. In March 2021, for example, we heard that Lufthansa announced plans that all aircraft over 25 years might remain grounded permanently to emerge from the pandemic leaner than before. And that message pretty much we heard from many airlines since then. Turning to the next page. The market has seen a larger proportion of leased fleet grounded by airlines, given the sharp decline in air traffic demand. Leased aircraft continue to face higher parked rates, but have reduced the gap from owned aircraft since its May peak. As of September 2021, 61% of all parked aircraft were owned by lessors, and the top 10 lessors have over 800 parked aircraft. That's not unexpected, as the airlines restructure, leased aircraft are often the ones that are first rejected. And those rejection rates tend to be higher than what we've seen for owned aircraft. There are fewer new replacement opportunities for lessors at present, and as more aircraft come out of service with bankrupt airlines ceasing operations, these aircraft then remain on AOG lists for lessors. If we look specifically at narrow body aircraft that are parked, we can see that lessors have 71% of that segment, which is not surprising as they own 58% of all narrow body aircraft in commercial operation today. Looking at the chart on the right, we can see that the parked fleet of the top 10 lessors. The top 3 of this cohort account for 28% of the top 10 lessors parked fleet. If I look at AerCap pre-acquisition of GCAS, it had approximately 180 parked aircraft, so 100 narrow bodies and 80 wide bodies, representative of a little less than 20% of its total fleet. And it's also worth noting that the top 10 lessors do account for 68% of all lessor-owned parked fleet. If I turn to the next slide. Regional aircraft account for 23% of the global commercial fleet, with leased regional aircraft taking up 24% of regional fleet. New popular regional aircraft such as Embraer E1s and the ATR 72-600s entered the market between 2004 and 2011. Their popularity amongst operators led to investor demand, which resulted in significant growth in the proportion of regional fleet, which is today owned by lessors. And we can see this from the slide that a higher proportion of turboprops and regional jets in lessors' fleets are reported by fleet databases to be off lease today. Today we can see that frequencies of departures by regional aircraft and turboprops are trending upwards to pre-pandemic levels. And sale and leasebacks of these types did continue throughout the pandemic period, as we saw that airlines were able to raise liquidity through sale leaseback channels, albeit these airlines themselves had very strong names. For example, Delta, we saw were able to close sale leasebacks on 11 CRJ 900s with Falco. AerCap also completed sale leaseback of E195 E2s with Azul. And Indigo closed a variety of ATR 72 transactions throughout summer 2021 with Gol and Sky. So if I turn to the next page. This is just the IATA's recovery slide. So the timing and slope of the ultimate recovery in demand, in global demand traffic, and that recovery, it's still not known. In short, however, IATA estimates that the 2021 RPKs will be 18% higher than 2020 levels, although still 59.7% lower than 2019 levels. In H1 21, global RPKs were down 67% compared to 2019 levels. including an 86% drop in international RPKs and a 33% drop in domestic RPKs. IATA now expects that passenger revenues of only 227 billion will be accounted for in 2021, which would represent a 63% decline from 2019 and only a 20% improvement compared to 2020 levels. IATA also estimates that the 2022 RPKs would be 51% higher than 2020 levels. Again, although it's still only 39% lower than 2019 levels. So if I turn to the next slide, I'm just going to now move on to the aviation debt market and just go through some slides that we've prepared. So if I turn to the next page, the aircraft financing industry is fundamental in supporting growth of global aviation. Aircraft operating lessors own approximately 45 to 50% of commercial aircraft fleet, and airlines rely heavily on capital markets, commercial loans, and other financing channels to fund their fleet growth and modernization strategies. In addition, over the past decade, the aircraft trading market was very active until the pandemic hit in early 2020, and most of the trading activities were leveraged through the debt market. The aircraft financing market can be broken down into two segments. The primary market serves the financing needs for new aircraft deliveries, where both airlines and lessors are active participants. And the secondary market is focused on the financing of used aircraft. A majority of the volumes in the secondary market support aircraft transactions with a smaller portion serving the refinancing needs from airlines. The aircraft financing industry has historically exhibited relatively stable performance and mild volatility. Investors have been attracted to aircraft as hard assets because they're typically US dollar denominated with reasonable liquidity in the global marketplace. Aircraft as hard assets lose value over their economic lives, and each type exhibits different residual value retention profiles, not just to each other, but also over time and based on the market cycles. The introduction of new, more advanced aircraft also has an impact on current generation values. However, loans are typically issued for shorter durations than the economic life of the underlying assets, and amortization schedules usually decline at a more rapid rate than aircraft value depreciation itself. Aircraft financing has historically been vital to the development of the industry. While risks are always present throughout the aviation industry and in the current environment particularly, the continued growth of the financing market over the long term is assured. Post-GFC, the aviation financing industry experienced remarkable growth due to the healthy development of the global aviation industry, especially in the Asia-Pacific region, a stable financial environment with a low interest rate, and an increasing appetite for aviation exposure from the investor community. Historically, financing activities typically slowed down during the global economic downturns. However, since the outbreak of COVID-19, the financing industry has provided strong support to key airlines and lessors, with record amounts issued in 2020 and continuing throughout 2021. Because of the market liquidity, many investment-grade airline and lessor issuances were able to achieve similar or even lower interest rates than in the pre-COVID market. Debt financing issuances increased from an estimated 138 billion to approximately 227 billion in 2020, most of which were issued to airlines to support liquidity and operational needs amid their current crisis. So if I turn to the next page. Strong credit airlines and lessors have been able to achieve attractive rates with an overwhelming demand for their issuances post-COVID-19, while poorer credit borrowers faced severe difficulties in accessing liquidity, forcing many into restructuring or liquidation. The types of collateral have expanded beyond traditional hard assets, such as aircraft and engines, into other intangible assets, such as frequent flyer programs, where American, Delta, and United each secured billions of loans using their frequent flyer programs as collateral. Additionally, top-tier airlines have been afforded the option to raise capital through convertible bonds, which generally feature lower coupons, but are embedded with the option to convert to common stock. And we saw Singapore Airlines break the history books this year with one of the largest unsecured issuances in history. Following the COVID-19 outbreak, government-supported lessors and other top-tier lessors have not been challenged to access unsecured financing, with the cost of funds remaining relatively consistent with pre-COVID levels. As lenders value their diversified asset portfolio with a built-in asset management team capable of proactively managing that risk. Although air traffic hasn't fully recovered, the ABS market has reopened, particularly for aircraft and engines leads to stronger credit airlines. We've seen 7 new ABS transactions issued this year so far, with more expected. EETCs also broke a new record issuance in 2020, as airlines were desperate for liquidity. Major established airlines remain able to secure large amounts of funding through EETCs, a trend that is expected to continue, although volumes may moderate from 2020 levels towards more we would see as typical levels over the coming years. And although with strong growth in mainstream financing channels, there's also been many new products and platforms that we've seen emerge, such as enhanced credit insurance and non-back lending facilities. If I want to turn to the next page. So here, just on this slide, acquiring debt can significantly enhance an airline's competitive strength. Debt financing enables an airline to grow much faster than their cash balances would allow. So it opens up those new opportunities. It also allows an airline to execute fleet modernization plans, optimize their operation to improve efficiency, as well as implement various other improvements that can better position the airline against its competitors' offerings. On the financial management side, airlines can smooth their cash flow requirement with debt financing for better budget planning. Also, taking on debt when interest rates are low allows airlines to lock in the lower ownership costs, as has been the case over the past decade. In the secondary market, airlines can also generate additional liquidity using their unencumbered assets, especially during market downturns. By taking on loans and thus fully owning the asset eventually, airlines can have a better control of their core fleet with fewer concerns over the spot market volatility for leasing assets, or an inability to secure the desired asset when there's a need for an expansion strategy. While owning the asset also entails this residual value risk for the aircraft fleet deemed fundamental to its long-term business strategy and expected to be in its fleet for its long-term economic life, residual values then become less of a concern for an airline. Looking at this slide, airline leverage has significantly increased during the pandemic, as many airlines across all regions raised debt during a period of sustained cash burn. And many airlines increased their total liabilities by over 20%. Although some airlines with strong support from governments have acquired debt at low interest rates, the large volumes of airline debt have accumulated to survive the pandemic and will likely impact their future cash flows through increasing debt and interest repayment obligations, and that might potentially impact investor returns in the long run. So it's not surprising when we look at this chart that American carriers are at the top of the leaderboard, given the expansive support that came in various forms that they received from the onset of COVID-19 from the US government. It's also worth noting that carriers that have carried out a formal court-led restructuring will come out of COVID, with a lighter debt load, and those who did not have the opportunity to restructure debt and lease obligations, or streamline its business structure, reduce its fleet through personnel layoffs, and possibly even revise business plan. So if I turn to the next page. COVID-19 consumed a vast amount of liquidity. As we look at this slide, we can see that despite the strong support from government, many airlines still have weak liquidity positions. In fact, government and third-party support has simply extended a lifeline to some and distorted the timing of further in-court and out-of-court restructurings for others. As air traffic continues to recover in most regions around the world, support for governments and industry partners might not be extended. And some of them might decide to pull the plug, or at least withhold giving extra liquidity on certain weaker airlines, which potentially will cause more airlines to undergo restructurings in the next 12 to 24 months. For example, the Norwegian government withdrew its financing support for Norwegian Air Shuttle in November of 2020, and soon after that, the carrier entered bankruptcy protection. Norwegian emerged from the restructuring in May 2021 with a new capital raise, an enhanced balance sheet and liquidity position, as well as a new business plan on serving the Nordic region. If I turn to the next page. Government support through COVID increased as aviation was deemed critical to infrastructure. And we've seen governments have already supported and provided liquidity and assistance in excess of 244 billion in aid to airlines. And that came, as I mentioned already, in various forms. When we look at airlines forward bookings today, they continue to be impacted by this shortened booking curve. And this actually limits airlines' visibility for scheduling, and it strains airlines' cash reserves, as well as putting thousands of jobs at risk. Airlines in regions where governments have been reluctant to support the air travel industry, notably Latam, Latin America, and Asia, have faced disproportionate rates of serious peril. We also saw Avianca, Air Mexico, and Latam in Latin America undergo restructuring. AirAsia X, Malaysia, and Thai have all also faced various bankruptcy and restructuring proceedings. If I turn to the next page, just in terms of lessors. So top tier lessors have not been challenged to access unsecured financing, and were even able to take advantage of the current market to raise even lower financing, especially through the capital markets, with the cost of funds remaining relatively consistent with pre-COVID levels. We saw some lessors were able to raise lower cost financing to pay their current and existing expensive facilities. For example, DAE raised over 2 billion in unsecured notes in 2021, with coupons ranging between 1.55 and 3.38%. And part of those proceeds were going to be used to redeem its near-term maturing notes, previously priced at over 5%. We also saw ALC tapped the capital markets multiple times with unsecured notes offerings at historically low rates, such as 0.7 to 0.8% for its $1.55 billion offering, which is due in 2024. With part of those proceeds, or those net proceeds, to be used to pay off and repay existing debt. The ABS market was temporarily paused in 2020 since the outbreak of COVID-19. However, as that market gained more visibility of a recovery path, a strong return to ABS issuances have been observed in 2021, with further ABSs expected. If I turn to the next page. Rating agencies are focused on debt and equity ratings when assessment of investment grade ratings for lessors. And the rating itself is so important with regards to assessing cheaper debt. This slide it looks at the fact that a lessor's debt to equity is so important. And due to the capital intensive nature of aircraft leasing, lessors' debt to equity ratios are, they're generally high. The high leverages emphasize the importance and need to access cheap debt for competitive advantage. Debt to equity is a crucial factor considered by rating agencies to determine lessor credit ratings. Therefore, lessors such as aircraft have had a stringent policy of always maintaining its debt to equity ratio at 3 in order to support the maintenance of its investment grade rating, which ensures access to cheap sources of funding. Below and on the right-hand side, there are some examples of where there have been significant debt to equity fluctuations in the past decade and also through COVID-19. And maybe if I just mention one or two. So ALC was on a period of aggressive fleet expansion with initially 40 aircraft at the end of 2010. And that grew to 155 by the end of 2012. And the lessor itself also took on a higher level of financing to support that fleet expansion. So we can see through ALC's line on the left-hand chart how it had spiked in percentages. And also, if I take Fly, for example, Fly Leasing had been gradually transforming it to its younger fleet and smaller since 2015. It was in early 2018, and Fly Leasing announced the acquisition of AirAsia portfolio, and then we saw the debt to equity return to a much lower level. If I turn to the next page. So most lessors have been able to maintain investment grade ratings through COVID-19. With only, I suppose, just one notch around it, a downgrade. And the primary reason for this is that the rating agencies believe that while there are considerable headwinds and that they still exist, they have sufficient liquidity to meet a reduction in financing and our cash flows with enough headroom for asset impairments. And they would have stressed these assumptions, with a variety of downside scenarios. For example, the rating agencies would have looked at increased defaulters, a longer period for deferrals, a higher number of repossessions and AOG periods. If, for example, the lessor was not able to tap the capital markets for a period, et cetera, et cetera. So this slide, I think, is going to be an interesting one for us to watch and to monitor going forward as we see the fourth wave of COVID hit and winter in the Northern Hemisphere arrives. And just the overall stress that we do expect to see in lessor portfolios around the world. Now, just turning to the next page. I'm now just going to briefly talk through some airline and lessor restructurings and how we see the opportunity for investors to maximize ultimate recovery over the coming period. So turning to the next page, successive crises in early 2000 have led to negative net profits for airlines and failures for many financially weaker ones. Similar dynamics have faced the industry in 2020 and 2021, with an unprecedented number of airline bankruptcies and restructurings due to COVID. Flag carriers and major airlines are also not immune to the crisis, as we see Aeromexico, Avianca, Latam, Thai Airways, Virgin, and Hainan all going under court restructurings in the past 12 months. While COVID-19 pandemic continues to drag on across the globe without full visibility into the recovery, more bankruptcies and restructurings should be anticipated. And as you can see, COVID didn't discriminate between scale, franchise, strength, or fleet size than it took casualties over the last 18 months. Similarly, no region or aircraft type was immune, and many of these rejected aircraft are still AOG with lessors today. Turning to the next page. So the next two slides are just case studies on airline restructurings, and I will take you through the Virgin one in detail. On April 2020, Virgin Australia, Australia's second largest airline, announced it was entering voluntary administration to restructure and to recapitalise. Virgin Australia was already in a weak financial position prior to the pandemic. And as COVID-19 pandemic broke and Australia went into lockdown, Virgin Australia quickly ran out of cash, and demand for air travel completely dissipated in Australia. Virgin Australia was heavily leveraged at the time, following crucial fleet and network changes aimed at trying to improve its competitiveness and performance. Rating agencies had also downgraded Virgin Australia at the time, which made it harder for them to secure new financing. Following the denial of assistance and funding from its main shareholder, as well as the federal government, Virgin Australia's board decided that filing for voluntary administration would be in the airline's best interest. After 7 months of restructuring, on November 17th, 2020, Virgin Australia exited administration with the ownership of the airline sold to Bain Capital. The restructuring plan included layoffs, a reduction of fleet size, including the phasing out of all wide-body aircraft and suspension of long-haul international flights, with the new Virgin Australia restarting as a mid-size carrier, focusing on domestic and regional markets. According to CAPA, the fleet database, and Reuters, out of 122 aircraft in service and in active aircraft that were originally operated by Virgin Australia, including those at Virgin Australia Regional, only 56 were retained when it exited administration. Among the 66 aircraft that were rejected, a mix of narrow bodies and wide bodies, and 2 Fokker 100s were retired. With the COVID-19 pandemic still impacting most regions around the world and very little demand for second-hand aircraft, only 1 777-300ER and 6 of the 737-800s have transitioned to new operators as of August 2021. So that's 9 months after the restructuring was completed. And most of these aircraft were picked up by Regional Express, which was the smaller Australian carrier that had previously operated only turboprops, but then began competing on trunk routes in March of this year using Virgin's own, or should I say Virgin's own X738 aircraft. In 2Q of 2021, Virgin Australia also reportedly leased 10 738s that were initially rejected during that administration process, and recently announced plans to add another 9 737-800s in Q4 2021 and in Q1 2022. This 9 includes a small number of 737-800s if rejected through the administration process back in 2020, as well as several other aircraft that were previously operated by Singapore Airlines subsidiary Silkair. And we also saw in the news this week that Virgin Australia are supposedly back up to looking at 84 738s, which again was the number it started with pre-administration. If I turn to the next slide, this is one where Latam is also going through restructuring, and it filed for bankruptcy protection. In May 2020, Latam Airlines, the largest airline in South America or Latin America, filed for Chapter 11 protection Its affiliates in Chile, Peru, Colombia, and Ecuador, and in the US were also included in that initial filing. In June 2020, Latam Argentina ceased operations. And then in July, Latam Brazil also came in under the Chapter 11 to facilitate the group's access to DIP financing. At the end of 2019, it was estimated that Latam held $2 billion in cash balance and had credit lines, which was reduced to 1.3 billion at the time of filing. Although its cash balance was still strong, the rapid deterioration of air traffic due to COVID-19 and the absence of government support in the region, coupled with the airline's massive debt level, and I suppose glum or dimmed outlook, the filing for bankruptcy protection was determined to be the best in the best interest for the airline. The Latam restructuring is still in progress today. Latam has reported that it has concluded negotiations with approximately 95% of its fleet. It had rejected 42 aircraft and left the fleet then with 302 aircraft actually by the end of 3Q21. The airline has proposed to raise over 5 billion for its Chapter 11 exit financing, which is reported to consist of 3.5 billion from share issuance, 2.25 from secured and unsecured debt, as well as 750 million in a credit facility. However, the airline has commented that the proposal will impose too much leverage and insufficient liquidity for the airline to execute its 5-year business plan post-restructuring. So during the restructuring, Latam rejected its obligation under its 2015 EETC, and that facility had 17 underlying aircraft attached to it, 11 A321s, 2 A350s, and 4 787s, and all of these were auctioned. During and despite the restructuring on its current fleet, the airline has finalized an order for additional A320s, 28 in total, and that was reportedly happened in August of this year. And that again is to assist its modernization plan. Latam still plan for exit of Chapter 11 by the end of 2021. And that also covers Latam. So if I turn to the next page. I think lessors have suffered also through the pandemic, again, to a different degree, because airlines are the ones that are first hit, and it's those cash flows then that feed the lessors. So the leasing industry has been impacted negatively by COVID-19. Since the start of the pandemic, almost all major lessors have experienced a surge in lessees seeking rent deferrals. Overall, it has been indicated that more than 50% of lease payment collections have experienced delays or just non-payment. Air Lease Corp, ALC, which owns a fleet of nearly 400 aircraft, is reported to have accommodated deferral requests for approximately 63% of its lessees as of August of this year. While Fly Leasing reported a rent collection rate of 56% between April and December of 2020. As air traffic recovers, at least in many domestic markets, the total rent deferral amount and collection rate have been improving due to improved airline revenues and an increasing number of airlines securing financing from various sources. ALC reported that 52% of its deferred rent had already been paid, or should I say repaid actually, and the rent collection rate for the 6 months ending in June 2021 was 86%. ALC's Q3 2021 collection rate was reported to be 94%. And GOSOP reported in August 2021 that its lease collections were at 77% of 2019 levels. In March 21, Fitch reported that basic rent collections were down between 40 and 60% as compared to January 2020. And utilization rent collections were down 60 to 70% across ABS transactions. Kroll Bond Rating Agency has been continuously downgrading many aviation ABSs since the start of COVID. I think the latest one was in August of this year, in which it further downgraded 36 ratings for 30 ABS transactions. Yeah. And while passenger air traffic has improved, in July 2021, Fitch reiterated a negative outlook for the aircraft leasing sector, stating that travel volumes remain low and airline credits will continue to be pressured in the near term, impairing aircraft lessor operating cash flow generation. Lessors generally rely on significant amount of leverage and use lease rental incomes to pay the principal and interest payments. Those lessors are not necessarily well capitalized to have faced difficulties and will continue to face difficulties making the required payments as lessees seek further rental relief. For leases terminated early, aircraft repossessions have been challenged by airline personnel cuts, court closures, especially in the case of a contested repossession. We've seen airport lockdowns and travel restrictions, also impeding technical teams getting onto site to take physical control of assets and collection of records. Returned aircraft, both from expected lease expiries and early terminations, are likely to be on ground for longer than in a typical market, as finding a new lessee is proving challenging, even at low rates in an environment with unprecedented low demand. Lease extensions, however, have been common in conjunction with lessors negotiating for the same in exchange for this near-term relief. So outside such circumstances, there is limited evidence that operators are keen for extensions as they look to cut capacity and capital costs wherever possible. Lessors have nonetheless been able to grow their share of overall aircraft deliveries in the near term. ALC reported in September 2021 that global aircraft deliveries attributable to operating lessors increased from 40 to 45% of total deliveries to approximately 60% as a result of access to cheaper financing, with financing costs averaging under 2% relative to 4% for large US and EU-based airlines. Overall lease payment collections is expected to slowly improve in the longer term as air traffic recovers and airline financial conditions improve after the current set of restructurings complete. The collection rate for now, however, remains low in many regions where the recovery has been sluggish, especially when we think of Southeast Asia. And again, with the backdrop of the fourth wave of COVID hitting the Northern Hemisphere and around the globe. If I turn to the next page. Maximizing ultimate recovery is all about staying disciplined in investment approach and in portfolio management across asset, country, and credit risks, and always being in tune with demand recovery. Investor appetite never wanes through the pandemic. Opportunistic investors view the current downturn as a great window, to enter the space. Some certainly chasing good credits, but there are many new JVs and funds that have been established over the past 12 months, such as Castle Lake's collaboration with Boeing Capital, for example. And that was for a $5 billion aircraft delivery financing fund, and up to a $3 billion new leasing JV platform between PIMCO and GCAS. We also saw a newly established $1.5 billion JV by Kennedy Lewis and Arena Capital. And also, let's not forget the newly established leasing company, VMO Leasing, with $1.1 billion capital already in place. But when we think of the future and we think about how to maximize recovery and maintain assets or asset values, in addition to managing risk, which we've mentioned, and again, the credits, the lessors and all asset owners will think about many different things to extract as much value as possible from these assets, whether it's engine green time harvesting, swapping out engines, freighter conversions. There's always a question as to when are there too many freighters, or at least I've been asked that recently. And again, it's demand recovery. It's how do we see domestic versus international, and what do people think of with regard to leisure and business. But I suppose the biggest thing that's probably hitting us, especially in Europe, and again around the world, is just ESG and the impact that it has on assets. There's certainly increased awareness on ESG from the general public, and corporations will certainly further, continue to consider this and further accelerate this with the trend. And this trend will be of aircraft upgauging and the retirement of older generation aircraft to achieve lower carbon footprint. However, look, I think everyone's aware that the current technology and infrastructure development does not yet support widespread distribution of SAF or electric or hydrogen propulsion engines. So I think over the coming years, we'll definitely see increased consideration and momentum with regard to ESG and what's needed to be done, especially with governments' regulation and support to reduce carbon emissions. And I think the quickest or the easiest point of reference there is in April of this year that we saw France finalized and put this ban on domestic flights that are under 2.5 hours. And their view was, look, that can be served by a high speed rail. We also see in Germany today that the government is looking to, or at least it's in discussion, but intends to issue a new subsidy program to provide up to 24 million in funding to replace each older aircraft with new technology assets. So if I turn to the next page. So this is the last slide. So historically, and I wanted to leave it on a little note of optimism, or at least a hopeful note of optimism. Historically, major downturns in the aviation industry have triggered airline bankruptcies, failures, and consolidations. So while the market is likely to see some M&A post-COVID, there is precedent for growth from incumbents and scaling up from startup airlines in the wake of industry shocks. The surge in parked aircraft and early retired aircraft during the pandemic is driving down aircraft prices. So it's opening the way for emerging players, particularly low-cost carriers or LCCs, where they want to grow their fleets, their capacity and their operations. In the United States, LCC Avelo Airlines launched in April of 2021, and competitor Breeze Airlines launched in May 2021. Hungary-based Wizz Air launched a subsidiary called Wizz Air Abu Dhabi in January of 2021 in a bid to break into this historically underserved Middle Eastern LCC market. Sharjah-based LCC Air Arabia also launched a subsidiary in Abu Dhabi in July 2020 and recently announced plans to launch an affiliate in Armenia. We saw Bees Airline launch in March of 21, Play, an Icelandic LCC looking to succeed the failed WOW Air, launched in June of this year. Norway-based LCC Flyer also launched in June of this year. Another Norway-based LCC is seeking to enter the market, that's Norse Air. And we saw Norwegian Air Shuttle founder Bjorn Kjos' new startup, new long-haul attempt now plans to launch in 2022. So several more airlines are expected around the world. Especially, I think the only other one that's probably really top of mind is the India-based LCC called Akasa. So while most of the startups that we saw through the pandemic have been LCCs or hybrid carriers, there have also been one or two following the charter or full service models, for example, Air Montenegro. But I suppose, look, my point is, no matter in whatever region you're sitting in, there is a list of new names on the playing field that will change the landscape and the geography of how things are being served going forward. And we're all aware of new platforms that are being set up and consolidation among the lessors. AerCap's recent acquisition of GCAS being the most prominent in the market, and everyone's wondering as to how it will change the industry going forward. And we'll also follow to see what happens with SMBC and Gosok. Joint venture sidecars, they're alternative ways for lessors to raise funding while strategically allocating assets in their portfolios. So effectively diversifying the lessors' asset pool and adding extra revenue streams. And we saw a whole host of that throughout 2021. In August, Airborne Capital and Mercuria Investment announced a new JV with it's called Mercuria Airborne Capital, targeting to provide alternative investment opportunities for Japanese investors interested in the aviation sector. And in January, we saw Worldstar Aviation announce the launch of its passenger to freighter funding program, which was backed by Oaktree, again offering funding solutions to airlines involved in conversions. So I think the message is clear that there is certainly optimism from airline entrepreneurs. You heard the list, and there's definitely no shortage of liquidity today chasing the space and to be ready for future growth. ISTAT Austin was well attended. Lessors are ready to grab an increased share of new deliveries. The MAX is back in service, and there's definitely pent-up demand. So I suppose the question is, what's not to be optimistic about? Although we all know that nobody knows what's going to happen in the next 6 to 12 months, especially with COVID. And on that note, Nils, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you, Leah. Very interesting. A lot of information here to digest. I think this was quite exhaustive because I have not seen any questions come in at all, which is unusual. I don't know, Jan, do you have any questions on your side that you have seen come in?
I haven't seen any questions coming yet. Maybe I can start with a simple question.
Are you going to give the answer as well, Jen?
So how for Leah, so how do you think about this new wave of COVID cases in Northern Hemisphere? Do you think it's going to have a similar level of damages to the aviation industry, or it's not going to impact it as bad as before?
Yeah, it's funny. So what we're seeing in Europe, Jen, is especially in the last week, 2 weeks, we're seeing lockdowns. We're seeing countrywide lockdowns, regional lockdowns, and increased COVID cases, where governments are, I suppose their health systems are nearly at their limits, or at where we were a year ago when all of Europe was locked down. And that's the concern. So the concern is we're going to see history repeat itself. And again, it's how much patience lessors have for airlines to give them further deferrals. And remember, these are deferrals on deferrals. So many of the big names are airlines with deferrals that are not, those repayments are not for quite some time into the future. And I think that's the piece. It's how much further lessors can bank on ever seeing that cash. And that's the question mark for most. So I think it's going to have, while I'm dying to get on a plane and go on holidays and haven't been, again, I haven't been traveling. So I think I'm probably one of many.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Leah. And here's one question we have from the audience. what's your thoughts on the small narrow-body market, since the large narrow-body aircraft are sold out for the next 5 years? Will there be a shift and a focus on the small narrow-body?
Yeah, I think the small narrow bodies is definitely a key. I think the crossover space between sort of regional and what we would call the what would have been known as narrow bodies in the past, I think that's going to be a big game changer going forward. And we saw that recently with increased orders for the A220s. I think regional aircraft themselves will probably, while regional demand is coming back and that piece of air traffic demand is coming back quicker, I think what we're going to see is just a period of flux. I think airlines will take what they can in terms of capacity, if they can get it at the right rates. And again, I think there will be this bridging impact, as we see and as we look to the coming months and we think about further airline consolidation. And look, you can read the press with Azul, Latam. You've seen what's happened in South America. We still have continued issues in Southeast Asia, which is heavy on the regional side. I think airlines will look to take capacity and try to grab market share and be ready for a rebound. So there will be a shift.
Yeah. And another question we have is, do you expect further M&A activities between major lessors?
Yeah, it's funny because obviously living in Dublin, the chatterbox line is always going. Yeah, it's bound to happen. You have a new mammoth with AirCap. I would have said AirCap and GCAS, but it's AirCap. And there's such a gap between them and even go down the pecking order, go down to Avalon, and so as you keep moving down through the top 10. And on top of that, the scale and financial wherewithal of the Chinese lessors to come in at any point in time, and if they wanted to join troops, that could easily happen. But again, it's the Chinese don't necessarily probably need to do that because they have these lower cost of funds anyway, so it's not necessarily going to be a driver, but definitely within the top 10 and even down beyond that. Because once you go outside the top 10 lessors, and they're the ones, remember, that they have strong names behind them. So it's not necessarily that it's a financial need, an immediate financial need, because they have these strong backers. But once you go beyond the top 10 lessors, down to sort of 10 and beyond, those lessors could potentially need to restructure if we have this fourth wave, which is as bad. Those silo SPVs just aren't getting cash flows to repay the debt, etc. So I would see that, yeah.
And it's sort of a related question. So even though the lessors are supported by financial institutions related to deferred lease rents, but our audience suspect that there will be a limit to this support too. So do you think 2020 will be a sort of far more pressure on airlines to pay their deferred rent, or do you expect this to linger on until 2025?
No, I think the downside is what, for a lessor, right? So if you're a lessor and you've already restructured and you have a deferral out there, you're already, you've laid your bet. So you think that you're going to get your lease payments back. But that was fine when we had no other place, or we being a lessor had no other place to push an aircraft. Whereas you're seeing the long list of LCC startups. You're seeing some domestic markets, are thriving back. Think Mexico, think India is popping back. Think China, just to mention a few. But there are some new places now that lessors can actually, or homes, should I say, that for lessors to place aircraft. So I think there will be increased pressure, and I think lessors would probably do this one level down. It goes from higher order 1 to higher order 2, and it's where is my bet? Do I think I'll actually ever see the return? And if not, just take the aircraft. So there will be, I think, this probably a stricter review of credits and future returns and deferrals, because anything that's already been deferred, airlines would, or lessors would have tried to at least stay economically whole on those deferrals, and they would have looked for extensions to the extent, the aircraft was capable of being extended, depending on vintage, or if it didn't have such a long lease term to start, where they were able to extract better terms up to now, they would have done that. So I think, I do believe that there will be a lot more lessor troubles airline troubles this winter.
Yeah. And the next question we have is, do you think with the recent lockdowns, governments will continue to provide funding for airlines as they did in 2020, 2021? Or do you think it's more likely that there will be more airlines going out of business and there will be an increase in aircraft availability above the current levels?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, Jen. And I know we've debated this ourselves when we're reviewing credits, right? It's twofold, right? Number one, governments come in and they effectively nationalize payrolls. That's the first thing. But above all of that, the infrastructure is critical for a country, to have an aviation market that works and airlines that operate and that their country is served, whether it's for commercial needs or medical reasons, et cetera, et cetera. So I thoroughly believe the governments will have to continue assisting. It might be, again, slightly different degrees. You'll certainly, across Europe, you'll have Ryanair and Michael O'Leary screaming about what has been given and what's unfair and unjust with regard to state aid. But I don't necessarily see there's any other option for governments going forward, to be quite honest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's the last question from the audience. If anybody else has any more questions, please feel free.
I was having one question. You showed this is kind of interesting. You showed a list of airlines that have started up, and you've shown a list of airlines that have been through restructuring. Now, this seems to me to be part of the normal process when you have a big crisis, that some will fail and they will restructure, and some will take advantage of cheap aircraft and cheap labor to start up anew. But isn't this a problem for the airlines that have been doing good, that have borrowed a lot of money to meet their obligations, and now they come out of the crisis with huge debt loads, and they are facing competition from airlines that have gone through this restructuring process, and they are facing competition from airlines that start off with a clean sheet. And if I look at bankruptcies among airlines as a function of the industry cycle, you find that a lot of bankruptcies actually occur a couple of years after the cycle has bottomed out. So the question is, do you think that Alton's big, day to make hay is going to be a couple of years from now?
I'm going red, Nils. I don't believe you've done this to me. Look, I personally believe when I look at the existing leverage ratios for the airlines, and we review credits for large institutional investors with aviation portfolios. So we're still across this. But as you look out for 2023, 24, 25, you see big crunch numbers with regard to repayments. So I do think, and do you know what? History has a habit of repeating itself. You and I have discussed airline cycles and cyclicality, and when the bankruptcies happen, I don't believe that that's going to be any different here. Do I think I'm going to make hay? Not as much as many other big names in restructuring, but look, I'm here to help. That's the message.
Yeah. And another thing that I couldn't stop thinking about when I looked at your slides, Leah, was that you had a very interesting table with the ratings of the source, the agency ratings. And I noticed that there were two lessors, I think GCAS and Fly, that had a one-notch downgrade. On the other hand, CDB had a one-notch upgrade. So overall, it was basically no movement in corporate ratings for the lessors since 2019. And then on another slide, I see how lessors have collected like 50% of their contractual rent, and you know,
but remember that's 50% of what's contracted. But again, what's the definition of contracted? The new restructured rent, the deferred amount. It's
right.
So that's why that was the bit nails. When I started first with the title about what lies beneath, I could have made this a little bit more eerie with lots of question marks. But in reality, look, everyone that's on this call and everyone that will look at this knows something about the industry. And there are so many pieces of this that can change the reality of what's going to happen with lessors and cash flows and airlines. And it's all just one ecosystem. Airlines are hit first, but in reality, you've airports, you've lessors, you've MROs, you've OEMs. It's just one, it's one, I don't know, what's the right word? It's not a secular reference, but it's one big system. And there's pain to be had and will unfortunately happen, for the years to come, I think, as a result of COVID-19.
Yeah. All right. I think those are all the questions. And so I want to thank Jan, I want to thank Leah so much. Very interesting presentation. And we see you back next Tuesday, 10:30 New York time, 15:30 Dublin time, with Olga from Oriel and Stuart from ICF to talk about aircraft values. All the best. Bye, guys.